I call the member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister update the House on the government's plan to achieve a continuous build strategy for naval surface ships, including the future frigates, and what that means for my home state of South Australia?
I call the Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And at the outset, as an electoral neighbour and colleague, may I congratulate you on your elevation to the speakership of this House. I thank the member for Hindmarsh for his question. Indeed, it was a delight to be with him in his electorate of Hindmarsh and to see the strong representation that he makes on behalf of the constituents of Hindmarsh. As the member indicated in his question, Mr Speaker, last week the government made an historic announcement. And that announcement, for the first time since the Federation of the Commonwealth of Australia, was a commitment to have a continuous shipbuilding, a naval shipbuilding industry in Australia. That's good news for our defence, it's good news for industry, and it's good news for workers. It's good news for defence, Mr Speaker. As the Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, said, it provides certainty for planning not just within Navy but within the Australian Defence Forces. It's good news for industry. As the head of Austral Shipping, Andrew Bellamy, said, this marks a transformative change for naval shipbuilding in Australia. And of course, it's good news for workers, including those in the honourable member's electorate of Hindmarsh. Indeed, the South Australian Premier, Mr Weatherall, said this: it creates jobs that workers in South Australia and around the nation want. So good news for our defence, good news for industry and good news for workers. And importantly, Mr Speaker, this reverses Labor's approach, because the reality is that the Labor Party in government had abandoned a naval shipbuilding industry in Australia. They had abandoned it. They had abandoned it. The honourable member opposite says The honourable member opposite interjects and says that's rubbish. Well, why didn't they order one single naval vessel in 6 years in office from an Australian shipyard? Just one. Just one.
The member for Scullin.
Australian vessel from
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Scullin on a point of order.
He should be directly relevant to the question. The question did not canvass alternative propositions.
Those on my right.
The question was about the government.
The Minister will resume his seat. I'll rule on the point of order. The Minister was asked a very specific question about shipbuilding. He's being relevant. He's entitled to range in the way he is. He has not moved off the topic of the question, and I'm going to call the Minister and hear the rest of his answer.
Mr Speaker, I'll repeat. In 6 years in government, the Labor Party did not order one single vessel from an Australian shipyard for the Australian Navy. Not one. That was their neglect of shipbuilding in Australia.
The Minister will resume his seat. The member for Wakefield. This can't be a point of order on relevance. There can only be one asked within a question.
Well, Mr Speaker, I've been trying to turn over a new leaf.
Resume your seat. Resume your seat. Resume your seat. The Minister.
Indeed, Mr Speaker, they ignored the advice from the Department of Defence that they needed to make a decision by 2011 to buy future ships for Australia, leading a potential capacity gap in the future. And indeed, the member for Lilly used Defence's budget as the government's ATM, ripping some $16 billion from the defence budget in Australia. So that's the record, Mr Speaker, of the Labor Party. So what are we doing, Mr Speaker? We've brought forward the offshore propelled vessels to 2018. We're bringing forward the construction of future frigates to 2020. We're going to continually build ships in Australia, which is good for our defence, good for our industry and good for the workers of Australia.